Have you ever wondered what it's like to truly encounter God? Not just feel Him in passing, but to have your life radically transformed in a single moment, a moment so powerful that it shakes your entire reality. Today, we're sharing 7 real stories of people who came face to face with the divine, and nothing was ever the same again. Marcus grew up in the streets, hardened by a life of violence and crime. By the time he was 18, he was deep into the drug world, making thousands of dollars every day from deals that could end his life at any moment. He had no time for God. He didn't believe in anything except survival. One night, after a big deal, Marcus was ambushed by rival dealers. They shot him twice, once in the leg and once in the stomach. As he lay bleeding out on the cold pavement, he felt the darkness closing in. He thought it was over. But then something incredible happened. He later described it as a bright light appearing above him, and in that light, he saw a figure reaching out to him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, but in his mind he screamed, "Help me, God!" And that's when Marcus says he felt a hand on his shoulder, not from anyone standing there, but from God himself. In that moment, he heard a voice, clear as day, "I am with you." The rival gang fled, the ambulance arrived, and Marcus survived. But more than that, he was transformed. He left the streets, turned his life around, and today he's a pastor, helping people break free from the same chains that once bound him. Rachel was at home with her 2 young children when the unthinkable happened. A fire broke out in her apartment. It spread quickly, trapping her and her kids on the 2nd floor with no way out. The smoke was thick and the heat was unbearable. The screams of her children echoed through the chaos as flames licked the walls around them. She had no way to save them, no way to escape. In sheer desperation, Rachel dropped to her knees and cried out, "God, if you're real, save my children." She said that at that very moment, the thick smoke parted and she saw a figure standing in the flames, a figure of a man glowing with light, reaching out toward them. She grabbed her children and ran through the open space. By some miracle, they made it out of the house just as the roof collapsed behind them. The firefighters who arrived on the scene couldn't believe what they saw. They said it should have been impossible for anyone to survive that blaze, but Rachel knew exactly who had saved her. God himself in the form of an angel. She will never forget the figure in the flames that led her and her children to safety. It was a normal day for Jake, a construction worker on a site. Storm clouds had rolled in, but he wasn't worried, just another day on the job. But as he worked on a rooftop, something unimaginable happened. Lightning struck the building, sending a surge of electricity through his body. In an instant, Jake was thrown from the roof, crashing to the ground below. His heart stopped. He was dead. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. Jake's pulse was gone. But here's where the story takes an unbelievable turn. As Jake lay there, he says he felt himself leave his body. He was floating, watching the scene unfold from above. But then he says he heard a voice, a deep, resounding voice that said, "It's not your time yet." In the blink of an eye, Jake was back in his body. His heart restarted, and by some miracle, he was alive. The paramedics were shocked. There was no reason he should have survived. Today, Jake is fully recovered, and he tells everyone he meets the same thing. God brought him back for a reason. The woman rescued from the kidnappers. Samantha was on her way home from work when her worst nightmare became reality. A group of men grabbed her and threw her into a van. She didn't know where they were taking her, but she knew it wasn't going to end well. Bound and terrified, Samantha prayed with everything in her, "God, please, save me!" Hours later, they pulled over in a remote location, preparing for what would happen next. But as one of the men opened the van door, something unimaginable happened. He froze. His eyes widened in terror and he screamed, "We need to get out of here!" The men panicked and fled, leaving Samantha behind. Later, she found out why. The man had seen a bright figure standing next to her in the van, a figure he couldn't explain, but that had terrified him into running. That figure, Samantha says, was an angel sent by God to save her life. The man who survived a plane crash. Jason was on a routine business trip, flying across the country on a small commuter plane. Halfway through the flight, disaster struck. The engines failed and the plane began a steep, uncontrolled descent. Chaos erupted in the cabin as people screamed and braced for the worst. Jason looked out the window and saw the ground rushing up to meet them. In that moment, he closed his eyes and whispered, "God, if you're there, save me." As the plane plummeted, Jason describes feeling an overwhelming peace flood his body. The next thing he knew, the plane had crashed, breaking apart on impact. Miraculously, Jason found himself alive, surrounded by wreckage. The fire and smoke billowed around him, but he was unharmed. Investigators later told him it was impossible for anyone to have survived, let alone walk away unscathed. Jason knew the truth. It wasn't luck or coincidence. He had been saved by the hand of God. The woman who walked away from a deadly car crash. Megan was driving late at night, coming home from a family reunion. She was tired but eager to get back. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into her car at full speed. The impact was so severe that her car flipped several times, crumpling like a tin can before coming to rest upside down. The paramedics who arrived on the scene assumed she was dead. But as they approached the wreck, they saw something astonishing. Megan was crawling out of the mangled car, alive, with barely a scratch on her body. She later recounted that just before the collision, she had whispered, "Jesus, protect me." She said she felt a presence in the car with her, holding her as the vehicle spun through the air. The doctors couldn't explain it, but Megan didn't need an explanation. She knew it was God who had shielded her from death that night. The soldier saved in the line of fire. David was deployed in one of the most dangerous war zones on the planet. It was his second tour of duty, and every day he and his unit faced life or death situations. One day, while on a routine patrol, they were ambushed by enemy forces. Gunfire rained down from all sides, and David watched in horror as his fellow soldiers were pinned down, unable to move. David knew it was only a matter of time before they would be overrun. As bullets whizzed past his head, he did the only thing he could think of. He prayed, "God, protect me. Protect us all." And then, in the midst of the chaos, something incredible happened. David describes it as an invisible shield that seemed to cover him. The bullets that should have struck him never made contact. He moved through the battlefield, pulling his injured comrades to safety, all while remaining unharmed. When the firefight ended, his commanding officer looked at him in disbelief. "It's like they couldn't touch you," he said. David knows that it wasn't just skill or luck that saved him and his unit that day. It was God's divine protection, a miracle in the middle of a war zone. Plane crashes, car accidents, gunfire in a war zone. These stories prove that even in the most dangerous, life-threatening situations, God is present, shielding, protecting, and delivering his people. The people in these real-life stories were all moments away from death. But through divine intervention, they lived to tell their incredible stories. In the blink of an eye, life can change, tragedy can strike. But these testimonies show that miracles are real, and God's power knows no limits. These encounters weren't just brushes with fate. They were moments when the Almighty stepped into the natural world and saved lives. Thank you for watching the Great Wise God Bible channel. If these stories have stirred your heart, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of God's protection and power. Miracles still happen, and God is always near, ready to show up in your life when you need him most.